Well, he stretched and then placed his axe ceremoniously on the ground before him, giving the weapon a few loving pats. Since you think we're as good as dead, Zero and I, won't you do an old dying warrior a final favor and at least try the outfit? Vera threw a pebble at his head, which Unnar dodged. I'm not here to fulfill sordid Nord fantasies about mountain savages. What about sordid Dunmer fantasies? Will those do you better? The Nord turned to the mark. Want to share one of those before we go? Not for all the gold in Skyrim. What happened to your sense of humor, you joyless mud crab? Unless you think I can dispatch the Forsworn with barbs, I suggest we get going. It'll be dawn soon. I'd rather not tangle with them in broad daylight. The demented Nord switched tactics again, drawing himself up and bristling with false outrage. What of our other arrangement, lass? Would you abandon your future husband in his time of need? I demand deference from my bride-to-be. He pounded his fist on his knee. Yeah, well, as your future widow, I suggest you take your demands and shove them, unless you want to first bequeath all your possessions to me, in written form. The Dunmer emitted a sound that sounded suspiciously like a choked snort. When Vera glanced his way, he was shaking his head, his hand over his eyes. Well, Unnar scratched his beard at the thought. You got a point there. Idiots. Vera sighed, glanced at the Dunmer, and motioned at his tobacco pouch. Roll me one, will ya? He cocked an eyebrow. I didn't realize you smoked. This might be a titch. Strong. I'll survive. As you wish. She wasn't sure what he was using in lieu of paper. Some very thin, gossamer-like material that put her in mind of dragonfly wings, but more supple. Or perhaps the gills of a mushroom. She found her gaze lingering on him when he was sealing the roll-up. A quick swipe of his tongue, efficient, then a practiced flick of his fingers as he tightened the cigarette. He caught her looking and smirked. Light? Vera drew back as a tiny flame swelled between his thumb and forefinger. She lit up awkwardly, drew the smoke deep into her lungs, rolling it around her mouth before blowing it out through her nose. The mixture was smooth, a bit minty. Whatever the active ingredient was, it wasn't nicotine. Some other chemical, sharper, with a faster edge. Any final directions from either of you? The Nord's ribald mask was flaking off quickly, revealing the alarming glint of nascent battle fury. As a matter of fact, Vera watched him warily as he unhooked the amulet from around his neck before tossing it in her lap. Hold on to that until I'm back, will you? It's meant for a very special lady. Wouldn't want the Hagravens to get the wrong idea. The thing was, they probably were going to die, all things considered. She ignored the sudden pang of sadness. What about you, Dunmer? Last directives? His eyes drifted to the skies, and then he grinned, all sharp edges and white teeth, and crooked a finger at her. How about a personal question? Won't matter if we don't make it, will it? Unner scowled, pantomiming displeasure. Pause to yourself, sellsword. Sellsword.
I don't pay you for that. Oh.
Now he worries about the terms. Vera scooted closer to where Demon Chops was sitting. He hadn't been particularly interested in personal details before, which suited her perfectly fine, except that now she was curious. He leaned down, close enough that she could feel his breath tickling her ear. He smelled like he looked. A sharp, slightly spicy scent with a hint of mineral heat. Abrupt, but not unpleasant. Well? Vera asked, suddenly acutely aware of her own skin. Where are you really from, Outlander? He whispered. And then he straightened and busied himself with his blade. Vera got to her feet, turned away to look at the dark water of the river. Some large nocturnal bird flew above, briefly shading Master's pale glow with its wingspan. If you come back alive, I'll tell you, she said to the water. A safe bet. She didn't watch them leave, busying herself with tending to the fire instead. Vera maintained the campfire for only as long as it took to keep their things from accumulating too much moisture when the temperature dropped below the dew point. Coal drifted off the water, pooling at the bottom of the steep river gorge. The sun would not reach into the ravine for 2-3 hours after sunrise, but the inconvenience of needing to dry everything out paled against the risk of having the smoke bring unwanted visitors. When the eastern horizon paled and the stars turned translucent, Vera kicked what remained of the burning driftwood apart, scattering the embers. If things went poorly for Under and Zero, especially if they went poorly early on, chances of a forsworn scouting party to root out their base camp was high. She had chosen a spot far enough away and inconvenient enough to access without making a ruckus, but the risk was not null. She looked up, her eyes tracing the scatter of the mage, still bright against the shrinking darkness in the western quadrant. Perhaps she should have tried harder to dissuade them. Then again, everyone was free to choose their own ending if they could, and most didn't get that luxury. True enough of the Nord, but had Demon Chops really chosen this? Was the promise of coin really worth that risk? How the hell did he balance those scales? Something irked her. An irritating little splinter of a thought, lodged at the back of her mind ever since her quip about Dunmer funeral rites. The way his mouth had twisted and his eyes had darted away at her question. Odd for a fellow who, at other times, had no problem with weaponizing eye contact. Won't matter a whit at this stage, he'd said. Nords, at least, cared deeply about their afterlives. Whatever Sovngarde really was, its promise seemed to override the fear of a messy death. Were Dunmer different in this respect? Barring unnatural causes, like, say, being sacrificed in some unpleasant Hagraven ritual and then eaten, because why waste good meat? Myr had longer lifespans. Perhaps, after a while, you just got fed up with the whole thing. Vera kicked the thought aside and got herself busy. She was going to need sleep. She had chosen this spot in part because of the beehive of small caves dotting the cliffside, where water erosion and winds had eaten away at the rock, forming shallow hollows, high enough above ground to keep skeevers and other wildlife from getting into food supplies, low enough that they could be accessed without climbing equipment. About 50 paces upriver along the stony beach, she discovered what she was looking for. A small cave, 2 meters deep, shaped like a teardrop. The rocks below provided decent handholds, and Vera hoisted herself up to the mouth of the hollow, careful not to slip on the moist stones. Inside, an old bird's nest, little more than a snarl of dried twigs and desiccated grass, was the only trace of the cave's former occupants. Vera brushed the debris aside, shouldered her pack into the opening, and climbed down. It was high enough that dragging their equipment into her new shelter would require some maneuvering, but a short craggy tree growing from a crevice above the cave would provide the lever she needed for her rope. By the time she was done, the sky had turned a soft pink, and Master hung pale and ghostly at the edge of the horizon. Vera settled inside the cave, her back against her pack, the pile of bedrolls cushioning her from the ground. She fidgeted with the unfinished cigarette in her fingers. She had not intended to keep the remaining blunt after her first lungful of the foreign mixture, but old habits of frugality died hard. Hoarding elevated to a philosophy of life, a shield against uncertain futures. She sorely needed sleep, but she felt restless and strangely unmoored. Perhaps the futility of waiting was starting to grate. Then again, perhaps the pair were going to come to their senses once they realized what they were up against and hightail it back, probably with a pack of forsworn on their heels. Vera fidgeted, her hand drawn to her bow, its smooth curve reassuring against her palm. Boredom. The most underrated emotion. Boredom meant you were safe. What did she even know about the forsworn? Her understanding was mostly limited to observation from afar, rather than any sort of conceptual grasp of their place in the mess that was Skyrim politics. They were native reachmen according to Luvenar and Breton, in designation if not quite in phenotype or descent. About 15 years before Vera's arrival, they had rebelled and were driven back. Since then, they were known to masquerade in plain sight. Your neighbor, your fellow miner, your nondescript customer that came in every Sundas to buy a health tonic. otherwise known as a cordial in every sense of the term. But Bothella's clever labels spared her clients from having to explain their more frivolous purchases to their significant others could have a double life as a forsworn. Or so people said, a little breathless with the pleasure of suspected conspiracy. In that sense, perhaps they were Breton, in the way that the largest rival gangs that tore Split City into two violent, mutually annihilating halves were sometimes described as American. At best, ironic nostalgia, a referent for a myriad identities only united on old maps, as mythical as the giant sea dwellers of Terra Incognita. At worst, a way to make one's own hands feel less bloody, to shift that weight to others, with longer and prouder and better remembered traditions of past cruelties. There was the more sinister sense too, whispers of warriors who cut out their own hearts to be replaced with something that was neither heart nor human. Stories of Hagravens that had bartered some of their humanity for odd powers that came with bird talons and a few other dubious trade-offs, but no wings. Beyond that, Vera only knew the surfaces of what she had been able to glimpse from a safe distance. They wore little, but didn't seem to be bothered by the cold, either from a habit of repeated exposure or through some magical or alchemical intervention. They did not favor metalwork for weapons or armor. They had some kind of symbolic relationship with stags, and the men's headdresses often featured a complex weave of antlers and branches, like some ancient woodland spirit from the third volume of the encyclopedias about the old religions of her dying world. Before the unworshipped showed up and swept up those who remained into their deceptively simple, impossible service. So her grim jokes aside, the thought of what would actually happen to the Nord and the Dunmer once they failed, and Vera had no doubt that they would fail, was all the more unpleasant for its uncertainties. This would have been a good time for her imagination to draw a blank, or at least a modesty curtain over the possible scenarios. But, of course, it did no such thing. If they were lucky, they would die quickly. But that was the thing with luck. You had it until it ran out. She had promised to wait. A long, pointless, and potentially risky exercise. But a promise was a promise. Eventually, she nodded off. You. Vera woke up with a jolt. An odd noise had yanked her out of shallow sleep. Well, that, and the crick in her neck. The sun's orange rays danced on the water, the river like molten gold. She'd overslept. Again. Vera tightened her hand on her bow and turned her head, slowly, so as not to draw attention to herself, and almost tumbled off her pile of bedrolls. A purple blob was gliding across the narrow strip of gravel beach, a coiling, pulsing, iridescent knot of ethereal tendrils, like vapor slowly coiling on itself inside a glass flask. Vera blinked. Changes. She turned her head all the way, and suddenly the light dissolved, like something smudged out with a grubby thumb. In its place stood a mud crab, a juvenile hatchling, judging by the size. Its eye stalk stretched upward, beady little eyes tracking Vera's movements. It chirped in warning and skittered backwards. What the fuck? She turned her head, bringing the critter into her peripheral vision. The mud crab reblobified, its outline now hosting the violet glow once again. The shimmer was familiar, exactly like the tantalizingly glimmer of Lovenar's gem. Did you swallow one of those enchantment crystals, buddy? The mud crab chittered menacingly. Oh yeah? You're pretty much a rat in a chitin suit, so don't get mouthy. She twisted out of the cave, dangling her legs over the drop. She stretched her neck, the muscles screaming in protest. The mud crab raised its claw and brandished it in warning. Have weapon, will nip. The gesture was so similar to Unnar's earlier quip about itty-bitty Bretons that Vera found herself snorting. Not impressed, huh? She jumped down from her perch, her fur-sole boots doing little to muffle the rattle of river pebbles beneath her feet. Let's see if you've been keeping an odd diet. She took a step forward. And if not, I bet you'll taste great with some wild garlic and a bit of butter. The mud crab inched sideways, its gray carapace catching the sun's refracted glare. Vera stalked closer. She wouldn't need the bow. For a specimen this young, A well-placed kick to the head should do the trick, as long as she could dodge the claw. The little critters were experts at ruining a perfectly good pair of boots. Apparently, this particular mud crab was wizened to the cruel ways of the food chain because it retracted its pincer and took off, lightning fast, zipping sideways along the bank, its legs clicking against the stones. After a moment of hesitation, Vera ran after it, following it upriver. The purple glow only returned as she kept the creature in her peripheral vision. Just as she was closing in on it, the treacherous crustacean lurched sideways, disappearing behind a rocky outcrop that jutted out into the river, forcing Vera to slow down at the water's edge. She weighed the advantage of a crab meat supper against the dubious pleasure of wading ankle-deep in the icy river. But if the little scavenger had, in fact, gobbled up one of those gems, because what else could explain its glowing tendencies, then cold feet wouldn't be such a high price to pay. Still, keeping one's boots dry and one's feet warm was another one of those underrated life necessities. Vera eyed the rocky jut. You might have 8 legs, buddy, but see, this is where you're not taking into account the simple evolutionary fact that I have opposable thumbs. Midway up the outcrop, Vera frowned, staring in consternation at the small fissure in the stone she was using as a handhold. She was talking to a mud crab. It felt perfectly natural under the circumstances. Who else was she supposed to talk to out here? But something about it still irked her. A feeling like she was missing something crucial and rather obvious. A noise drew her attention from the irritating thought, and she clambered up the rest of the way until she reached the narrow platform at the top of the rocky spur. On the other side of the stony outcrop formation, a narrow tongue of pebbly shore extended out into the water. Her mud crab friend was making its way across it at a deceptively leisurely pace,